returned back here relatively recently with the Rural Practice Project as adjunct professor of family medicine. Add to this a series of articles on the lifestyle of the miner and a vivid, engaged involvement, including being administrator of the Monongahela Valley Association of Health Centers in Fairmont, West Virginia for 18 years. And you have a sensitivity to politics, a concern for health policy, and active present involvement in the scene of health policy and the politics behind it. And before I introduce Mr. Ross, I'd like to tell you about another talk that he's giving this Thursday from 2 to 4. He's giving a talk on the lifestyle of the coal miner in Berry Hill 103 with slides, if you or any of your friends are interested in attending. Today he's going to talk to us on a subject that combines sociology, politics, and participant involvement, the mining disaster and the movement for black lung legislation. It's like to Mike Ross.
I think it'll be clear to you from both those remarks and what I have to say that my own experiences and prejudices have placed me most of the time in the camp on the coal miners or serving them in some fashion. What's relevant to the immediate area here on this subject matter which Duncan asked me to address is that the brown lung movement in southern textile mills is still struggling for the most elementary recognition as an industrial disease and to secure compensation for its victims 10 years after the events we're going to discuss. The other thing that I won't be dealing with is the historic connection between mine disasters and the safety legislation. It generally has not ever been any enlightened safety legislation for miners in any country without it being immediately following on major disasters that are colorful and attract a great deal of attention and take a great many lives. Let me give you the setting for the black lung movement. The situation was that an important occupational disease of coal miners was unrecognized until 1969. Although silicosis, which is the inhalation of rock dust and a much more rapid and obvious destruction of the lungs takes place in that case, has been always recognized. It was the inhalation of coal dust that was not thought to be dangerous. And therefore, there was no recognition of it despite the obvious large numbers of breathless and disabled miners for everyone to see in the communities when they visit. The miners themselves, of course, were quite aware of their conditions, and whether it was by formal resolutions to their legislatures or to their international union, or in their folklore, or in the poems that they published, the knowledge of lungs being clogged with dust was common.
Can I ask, can we interrupt you to go on, or would you rather not?
No, go right ahead.
Just a quick question on the point you're making on recognition. You mean that the medical literature itself hadn't recognized coal dust within the general classification of silicosis?
That's point one, that it treated it differently than just as it, the existence of, I guess, cotton fibers and other textile fibers in the case of what's called brown lung. And the disease, by the way, that we're talking about has a very long name, co-workers pneumoconiosis, so that it's nicknamed, and you see it made it politically easier to achieve results to get a quick nickname like black lung.
So the medical recognition of the disease didn't occur till 69.
I'm speaking of legal recognition. What you had was a debate in this country which broke loose only about the 50s, so that we were lagging by approximately a generation behind England, where it had been recognized by the late 1930s and was thoroughly recognized by the 1940s, and it was not recognized legislatively here as a compensable disease by itself. In other words, unless you could show that the man had inhaled by his occupation rock dust as well as coal dust, it was not regarded as compensable. Now, just to quickly give you an idea of, in terms of what it looks like, these are sections of lungs. Now, this is tissue, not X-ray. These would both be healthy lungs. And indeed, the one closest to me is of a 90-year-old school teacher, so you can see even with the inhalation of the norms of junk in the air, we still have good-looking lungs. Then you begin to see what's happening with things like cigarette smoking and so forth. It's when you get over here to massive fibrosis in addition to the pneumoconiosis that the destruction is almost total and people are now getting breathless. Or to give you a distinction, that's the lung of a man 10 years in the mines. Between 20 and 30 years, these are not necessarily typical. And this is, let me see, there's one here, that's where there's almost nothing left. The man's been underground 46 years and dies of heart failure. Very little function left in there. So that breathless miners were a commonplace in all coal communities, and men coughing up black sputum and all of the other signs of the disease. The earliest articles appear in this country of a serious sort only in the 50s. We really had the big scandal about silicosis only in the 30s. So, the 50s is when you begin to get the first debate, at least, minority of articles arguing, but unsuccessfully, unable to change the law and no mass following. That then is the background. It's a widespread coal miner occupational disease, and neither the medical profession nor, and they're connected, of course, the workers' compensation legislation is recognized. If that's the background, what was the event? There was a single event that took place in which I was involved. On November 20th, 1968, Armington No. 9 mine blew up 7 miles from where I live. And it's the last big mine disaster in the United States. 78 men were trapped there. And the important thing is that it was somewhat accessible compared to earlier disasters, and it was a much larger one, accessible to the media. So that for 10 days, they did not seal that mine while the American public was subjected to the constant scene of Hiroshima-like continuing explosions now, huge mushroom clouds. 16 major explosions took place, and of course the scene was of hundreds of family members who had received support services. At the beginning, there was some rescue operation. 8 more men were rescued during the first day from a terrible situation. After that, there were 78 left in the trap. But you had everybody in there, all 3 networks, New York Times, the British broadcasters, and it stayed on national TV for 10 days, so that the American public had never been subjected to as much of the scene of potential widows and orphans being interviewed, everybody else being interviewed, and a scene of mass hysteria connected with this mine disaster. I was personally involved, of course, didn't grasp I had set up support services at other mine disasters. In this particular one, we had first set up the first day's rescue standby, and that was accomplished. After that, you had 10 days of support services. You had them all kind of standing orders for nurses and social workers and the others who had to be present to handle the families 24 hours a day. And then after about 72 hours, you had to separate them from the press because of the constant interference with their grief by having microphones. There were usually between 50 and 100 reporters present, so that at times in the middle of the night they'd outnumber the numbers of family members present. And of course, I was unaware. It wasn't where my focus was, that this was you realized it was an historic occasion, but in retrospect, obviously, it was the event that brought together some forces that I'm going to discuss with you now. There had arrived in central Appalachia about 1964 a great many VISTA volunteers, dedicated young people who might have otherwise gone to the Deep South for the civil rights movement. And they were shocked at finding this neglected land, these neglected people, communities loaded with disabled coal miners and with widows because of the very high mortality in employment generally in the mines, the poor housing, the diet, taxes, legislation, inefficient if not corrupt union, etc., absentee ownership of the mines. This was all, and it was romantic in addition, so that it was, these were mountain people. They often had superb, colorful Appalachian traditions, and they tended then, I said, Central Appalachia, to bring in more and more of their friends. In the earliest, we statistically didn't understand, but it was the beginning of the Back to the Land thing that we would learn about after the 70 census, but it was reason to believe it was beginning by mid-60s because land was still $15 an acre in most of these places and had not changed in price for World War I and so forth. And the net effect was that they were concentrated in southern West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. And this had important consequences as to what kind of movement they put together. They had very little influence in northern West Virginia, in eastern Ohio, and southwestern Pennsylvania. This particular group of very skilled people often. Sometimes journalists, skilled, sometimes trained attorneys, sometimes political action people who have taken masters in some of the social sciences. Many of them saw a vast opportunity for social, economic, and political change in advance. They grasped what had started before the disaster, that they were moving in an area with very little opposition, very little press to note what they were doing, and a public that was very responsive to populist appeals, so forth. Others, like J. Rockefeller, who came that year, could see the opportunities for political advance. By 66, he ran for the House of Delegates. 2 years later, he was elected Secretary of State, and 2 years after that, he ran for governor unsuccessfully, then went into a laid-back position and was recently elected governor of West Virginia. Many others have gone on through the reform movement of the United Mine Workers, holding full-time positions in that, in the White House and other places. So there are a lot of talented people in that central Appalachian area, southern West Virginia, essentially eastern Kentucky. They were an important factor. They sometimes ignored the realities because of their skills of other things that were also in place. But I think they were equally important. One was that in place throughout Appalachia were well-established large numbers of local unions of the United Mine Workers, which a totally different atmosphere, say, in the state of North Carolina. As a backlog for what people could do without fear in small rural communities. They had moved together. They had not only moved in common action together, their entire union, unlike the rest of the American labor movement, was built on continual bloody struggles. Mother Jones was not the name of a magazine or a slogan. Mother Jones was somebody the older miners knew and remembered. They were experienced, these older miners, often in underground and guerrilla warfare, the only thing they had known how to do when the Indians were busted up to the 1930s. They were a powerful, potential local influence, not generally then in motion, or whenever they were called into motion, like when John L. Lewis called on his troops, they were shock troops. They were there. What I'm saying, I guess, is it's terribly important because when they tried to duplicate their activity, as you know, you think of the occasions, Brown Lung of steel workers, where you don't have this kind of background, then activists and reformers cannot register the success that they did here. The next thing that was in place was a very essentially weak establishment. It was in absolute control. It had dictatorial control, by which I mean the county seat, say, business and political establishment. But it was almost uniformly a clerk-level mentality. The absentee coal company simply never wasted anybody with any skills out of their Pittsburgh or New York or Boston or Cleveland offices. So while the corporations controlled state politics generally and had been able to buy and sell legislators like sacks of potatoes and have their will, essentially those of us that had dealt with them over a period of years knew they were both weak, you could easily disorient them or anything if you didn't use trigger words that they reported to their main office and this kind of thing. Another thing that was in place, and is not as important as these others, but important by parallel, is that the medical care program of the UMWA funds had, by that time, 1968, built a network of unparalleled prepaid group practice programs throughout Appalachia. In addition to a chain of hospitals now run by the Presbyterian Church-sponsored Appalachian Regional Hospital chain, they also had about 50 clinics. And that was a very important pre-existing thing in place. Somewhat ignored during all of this because it didn't suit the image, obviously, of a dictator like John L. Lewis. How could he have done such a good thing? Or have been a murderer or a corrupt figure like Tony Bowe also. But in place, nevertheless, and you only can understand it now by seeing how the same people write about it 10 years later, in 78. As the miners got defeated on the health care front this year, suddenly same people, some but the same names, are now describing an unparalleled, almost island of socialized medicine built by the mine workers, which is being taken away from them, forced back into the insurance system, which is what the rest of the American people are used to, fee-for-service instead of prepayment and non-salaried doctors and so forth. Now, the existence of that meant at least a couple of things. That there existed inside the Mine Workers National Office a very important health officer, Dr. Lauren Kerr, who had been calling unsuccessfully one of the major U.S. writers in medical journals for recognition of black lung. There existed in certain areas, such as the one I was at Fairmont Clinic, very skilled medical, administrative, and political leadership in particular places in that system. Now let me go back onto the main scene. And the main scene is essentially an activist scene. And it really goes into motion when all the pieces are there. with this unparalleled publicity. Bits and pieces are starting to fall into place between, say, 64, 65, 66, when some of them arrived, or a leading, very bright young activist like Craig Robinson, I think, arrived about 1967, so within a year he's putting things into place in his county. They're very bright people, they're very capable, and what they're beginning to do is try to form like their own organizations, like on the grassroots level. And if you have understood what I've said, it's going to be very possible to do this, in the sense of not having a very clever establishment to deal with, to stop. And remember, there's been funding by OEO of some potential change mechanisms in this period too, so there exists a very large regional legal aid organization out of Charleston, West Virginia, spreading into this whole area, which means young lawyers ready to try to break through the silicosis law. They're trying any kind of device they can do. Make each black lung case into a silicosis case by stretching the definition. They're trying to do anything, they're trying to bring lawsuits. They're suing Tony Vaughn on the UMW, on every front. But essentially, the vehicle they concentrate on is a brilliant one. They realize, as anyone who's been in it, that coal workers' pneumoconiosis is a horrible disease to try to get on the TV with or listen to the newspaper. You can't spell it, you can't talk to anybody about it, it's impossible. They nickname it black lung, and their buttons and their signs and everything, can make it very graphic. And the key organization that they come up with is the Black Lung Association, BLA. And you see, by parallel, the same people came down to form the BLA down here called Brown Lung Association, brought in some of the same physicians, some of whom I'll name, like Dr. Buck, that all came here very early when they were first starting up Brown Lung in the Carolinas. This had a tremendous following in that central Appalachian area, tremendous mass following, overflow meetings at schoolhouses or anywhere. And especially amongst pensioners, but very attractive to working miners who, remember, are not scared like the working textile workers are. So that the Brown Lung Association is unable to break through because of a non-union situation with anything but pensioners generally in the Carolinas, whereas this is very attractive. They also form a series of other organizations to appeal to other people. One is called Disabled Coal Miners and Widows, and that holds its own meetings. They don't know where everything's going to come out yet, but they are certainly having success at the grassroots.
You'll ask how they happen to move in that direction. Granted, this is a big problem, but you said at the beginning that disasters often lead to moves in the direction of safety legislation. How do they happen to rechannel this?
See, I cannot speak, and I haven't read the literature, if there is any written by these people describing what they've done. I know a great many of them, but I haven't sought to, ask them to be privy to, what went through their minds. I would say that we knew all the time in operating at Fairmont that many miners were frustrated at the problem which was raised here, namely that they would apply for under the acceptable guise of silicosis and have their claims denied, so that we got, for instance, Dr. James Walker onto the silicosis board. That was a big help because he was an enlightened physician in Charleston who would at least try to stretch the definition. You got to remember, a lot of miners, I better describe the work just a minute that leads to black lung. It's the mechanization of the mines that creates the vast amount of dust that we're now faced with. In other words, it's these ripping of these huge machines revolving with bits, rather than the old time. It might have created smoke to drill holes in and then blast, but it didn't create as much dust as this does. This requires an enormous amount of ventilation to keep a decent level of air, so the men are not inhaling a dangerous amount of dust. That's point one, is just the conditions, in the mines, so that there was a constant awareness of ventilation as a problem. A great many grievances that the men had over ventilation was a problem in those years. For instance, underground in the mines, before this federal law was passed in '69, at the face of the mine, say if that rear wall of the face of the mine, this is the machine, right? A machine, say 28, 30 feet tall, a continuous mining machine. Behind it, another loading machine. With the tail end piece of this one runs right into it. Then with large flooding headlamps up there, it generally was impossible when I was, would be underground in the 60s to see the man across that machine, which was usually about 8, 10 foot across. So you'd vaguely be aware of it. And that was how bad the dust is. Now that's an obvious dust level. You're dealing with a law later requiring a reduction in it of such a massive nature that they're going to bring it down to like, 3 microns per cubic foot, which is, these are tiny particles, can't even be seen by the human eye. They're going to demand that there be so much ventilation in there that they'll infuse that cold face with water in advance of going into it. That they'll have water at all these machines. Very often the water sprays were not even functioning on these machines. That was the general conditions for the background. That dust was a key issue. The other thing is that the pension miners, remember, could retire from age 55 on if they had at least 20 years service under the UMW contract. So that was hard to live on. And therefore, these were skilled people while they were working miners, as trade unionists and all, and were raising a benefits issue that would mainly affect them. To this day, you see, it didn't break through. In other words, the act of working keeps you from being diagnosed as disabled. You see, you're in a trap. Like a miner who would like to get a reading, if your examination shows that I am that ill, will you tell me that I'll get a black lung payment if I retire? See, he feels breathless. You can't ask a hypothetical. You have to end your working life and go to risk. You see, this is
Before you
still
can
a
even
problem.
apply for compensation? Before you can even apply for some
Yeah, well,
sort
you
of
can apply for
compensation?
workman's comp, but I'm talking about under the federal law. This is the worst people that get trapped in this are the men who have enough years of service and are not retrainable and are not easily out migrants.
They're
So
55
they're
or
on
so.
45 to
Yeah.
55. They really like to get out, a lot of them, and this is still a problem of trap where they cannot get a prior reading. They can get a doctor to give them an educated guess based on their x-ray or their pulmonary function test or this kind of thing, but they're in a bit of a trap. You asked me, why did they pick on this? Well, safety per se is not that hot an issue. You've got to understand, safety in the abstract historically has been a troubling issue for the miners. If you call enough attention to what's wrong, you lose money, you see. Suppose there is a machine that's sparking, it's dangerous, you should say, well, they should be smart enough, like not carrying cigarettes with them underground, they should be smart enough to call that to the company's attention. But in doing so, the man who does so is going to knock a shift of 300 people out of work. I mean, if he successfully points this out to them, well, you guys know. You've got to understand, unless the penalties are shifted in safety completely over so that safety is not a burden on the working miner, safety can, for those reasons, I don't want to say I've listed them all, you can begin to understand why they don't raise a safety issue first. Safety comes into play after a disaster as part of their general antagonism and anger on a whole front of things, including safety. But you don't abstractly or intellectually generally raise safety as an issue. Safety has some bite to it too, and to this day does. No, nothing is quite that settled, you see, that a safety grievance is that easy for the men to bring up. That's why it's much better for a federal inspector like we do now. The state inspector, have them more numerous and around, and so that at very large mines today, you do have much better inspection. These men can penalize the company, you see. They can give them one warning, an hour later come back and say, we told you ventilation was no good, you did nothing to correct it, put as large a plan on them as possible and hope that, accumulate in fines, $50,000, $100,000, and that way get the safety corrected. You can't expect the rank and file committee, unless you turn about more of the rules than we have even up to now, to get away with it with a successful drive on this. Benefits, on the other hand, will get the support of the whole community, small businessmen, everyone. This will mean money into the community, just like pension tax. Now, They've got then spreading, and if you remember geographically, out of southern West Virginia and East Kentucky, the principal vehicle called BLA, the Black Lung Association, related organizational vehicles, and I don't want to go into them all, but if you remember that era, some of the same young people organized national welfare rights, NWRO units, CSEJs, Councils for Social and Economic Justice. They took over the Council of the Southern Mountains, the activists from an old established one in that period. There was a lot going on, okay, in terms of nowhere per capita was there an infusion of as many activists and strangers as in Central Appalachia in the United States. Okay, you might have said, well, it was once, but the blacks took care of that, you know, in portions of the Delta. When the black consciousness said, you know, we'll run our own movement, we don't need you. There was no such movement of the people saying we'll run our own affairs. There was a welcome map. They found a very, if possible to exploit a very excellent situation. And these organizations went into motion, especially with the Farmington number 9. You still got to see it as the activating event. The following things happened. That's where I first met Dr. Buck, who's the leader of a highly unusual organization that becomes, it's never been paralleled in our country's history.
How do you spell it?
DUFF. He arrives, gets through the police barriers and arrives where we've got the families down there being fed by the Salvation Army. And I know who he is and all. He's been on TV. But he's been like on the governor's air pollution. He's been blasting the big companies for polluting the air, chemical companies, this kind of thing. And he has the genius. He's about 60. His enemies in the medical society say the reason he's got all this energy is that his extremely young and gorgeous wife has just run off with Vincent St. John, who came to Charleston to give a lecture, and she left with him. That's how the medical society deals with him. You know, why is Dr. Buck changed from a conformist, fee-for-service heart specialist, you know, in Charleston? Well, he doesn't know what the hell else to do with his life. In observation, I don't know when I've seen as fine a populist agitator, not as fine a doctor. He sometimes holds the x-ray upside down, he sometimes gets his EKGs mixed up. He needs scientific balance, seriously. He's a self-proclaimed heart specialist. He has not taken his boards in cardiology, he hasn't even taken his boards in internal medicine. Oh, his heart's with the miners. He's a man of utter goodwill, and he's ironclad about this disease. You know, he becomes Mr. Black Lung. But above all, he's an actor on top of being an agitator. So that he carries to every schoolhouse wherever he goes and gets on TV, and he's on it nightly now. After the disaster's over that winter, he sets up an ad hoc organization. It's called the Physicians Committee, I think, on Black Lung. It's really a paper organization. That I know by, you know, interviewing somebody, because one of my good friends is balancing doctor, Dr. Don Rasmussen, a chest specialist, joins it. And then a congressman's son-in-law, Dr. Hawley Wells. The three of them, really, Dr. Buck is the heart of it. And in a big mass meeting, Dr. Rasmussen very calmly presents, you know, pulmonary function studies and low-key stuff. Is a beautiful, well, they're a beautiful pair, and sometimes Hawley Wells is along, who's obviously ambitious, planning to run for Congress himself. And the three of them become what the medical society also calls a three-ring physician circus, because they can't stand their sight. They travel the state, and they interlock with these grassroots organizations in such a way that if the BLA, the Black Lung Association, puts out the leaflet and they're coming, if in a given county there are not 3 members of the Black Lung Association, the fact that the doctors are coming, the TV cameras are coming, will fill the schoolhouse. And the media, the young people who do the legwork, the hard legwork of all of this, know how to handle the media superbly, so they remain absolutely in command. The establishment never does. is able to get any counterbalancing, materials in. They have a high level of humanity, and all of this movement rapidly takes on an anti-Boyle tone, an anti-incumbent UMW leadership tone. Okay, remember now, Boyle has been elected president of the Union, I think it's 68, and this is 69, for like a 4-year term. And he's a colorless, in fact, he insists on wearing, it appears, black fedora hats so that, he almost looks like a movie gangster, in the way he conducts himself. If he isn't one, he has the worst PR, so the thing couldn't have been set up better in media terms. No matter what he says, he looks like he's, talking wrong when he's interviewed. Coal operators, I described already, their spokesmen are awful. Been no improvement, so that this whole thing is riding out beautifully. The physicians, Greasom, led by Dr. Buck, he undoubtedly gets the highest marks. He died subsequently. He came down to help the brown lung in the Carolinas get established without any success. He predicted a great deal of success, but he never understood a deep political issue like that. He only was a surface understanding man. Like in talking with him, you could never show him that there's no way in the world a mass meeting of working textile workers are going to greet you. He thought 1,000 people would greet him in Greenville, South Carolina, or Plymouth. They're scared to death. I mean, they won't see their shadow. The union leader can't get 6 of them out unless they got collective bargaining rights or some way. You can only get pensioners, and half of them are going to be somewhat scared. That's your only potential audience. He would think he could parallel, as many of the young people did, without understanding the historic significance of these hollows throughout Appalachia being essentially peopled by movement. United Mine Workers locals were the people's movement. They were the community. In other words, a local union meeting could truly speak against Wall Street or anything, and if that was the mood of it, that would be the mood of the community. That just like it is on these contracts. I mean, you've seen in 10 years later in 78, the first time in American labor history in which leaderless, you might say, they're able to come up with the most sophisticated voting patterns that, all the McCarthyite and McGovern type of storefront politicos couldn't have dreamed up better what these rank-and-file miners did all by themselves in a statesmanlike way of staying out long enough to reject the worst aspects of the first 2 proposals and then being weary and wondering how the hell they could send anybody back in. You're getting some idea of the sophistication and the mixture of young, bright people and older, wise people, that make up these communities. Now, I'm going to close out by describing a few things, since all of this I did after talking to Duncan, and he thought it was worth just presenting to you. What came together was an informal, what became necessary, unstructured coordination. That's what became necessary. There was never a meeting. Never did certain groups representing the older union establishments sit down with these potential reformers trying to overthrow them. Never did the young activist threesome of doctors sit down with the older established doctors that have been fighting for black lung reform. And there was nowhere was there coordination. But some of us recognized that what was breaking was historically very important, and you just had to do all you could to coordinate here. That it was in danger of still not having a complete success. We didn't know if we'd have a success at all. But you certainly might not have had one if you didn't coordinate a little bit here. The first thing that was secured in the winter of '69 was a scared West Virginia legislature. Bills are introduced to recognize black lung disease, for more mine safety, etc. And this leads up to, by February, a joint session of both houses of the legislature have hearings on the whole matter. This becomes the focus of attention of the coal operators, of the medical societies who stand side by side, and then of this huge wave of different forces who don't talk to each other in some cases, For instance, a great many members of the legislature are going to ask the established district And local leaders of the UMW, what do you think? Which one of these bills do you want? You see, they're not ready to accept the ones, say, thrown in by the reformers. There's 5, 6 versions, all this stuff. You've got to somehow come out of this, with a compromise. You've got to somehow succeed. Behind that lies the following. The movement has such grassroots that one congressman swings over and becomes its national spokesman. That's Ken Heckler of the Huntington District, a professor of political science, and a author of The Bridge at, where is it, Remagen? He's the Army historian that does paperbacks on it. And by picking up a warehouse full of those paperbacks at a nickel apiece that were unsold, I think he dumped them all over his district and got elected the first time, and after that he made it on a good record. He becomes the far-out like spokesman for the reform movement. He's like calling for Tony Boyle to resign before, the others are. He's calling for, national legislation. Senator Harrison Williams of the Labor Committee in New Jersey becomes a very big figure. He's ready for black lung legislation in the Senate. So that right behind the joint session in February of '69, the House and Senate hearings that spring are going to be held. Which means that there's got to be some kind of coordination, because the UMW Boyle leadership is purely defensive, scared, and you got well-established senators like Byrd and Randolph, who are running scared of the movement, but still very close to the co-op operators and worried about where it's going and what's going to happen. All the following things then fall into place, and I'm not trying to assess them now, I just want to give you a series of things that occurred. The enormous and widespread use of the media by the physician group, the so-called three-ring, circus, and the mass rallies of the grassroots organizations continued that entire winter. That's a major factor, no question, in turning public opinion. It's like utilizing a disaster where you get a public opinion favorable to the coal miners, and you utilize it, the maximum. Second thing that occurred is that the working miners, not just the pensioners, moved into action as the hearings in the West Virginia legislature commenced. And in part, certainly the activists must be credited in Southern, because the movement started in Southern West Virginia locals. And that gradually becomes an unauthorized or wildcat strike that spreads over and closes down the entire state of West Virginia. Just so you get an idea of what all
the
it takes
mines
to
or
have successful
everything?
legislation. Huh?
All the mines or
Yeah,
everything?
absolutely. Like, for instance, Northern West Virginia was latently supportive of it enough to accept just the signals of, rolling pickets or anything. It meant the entire state went down, even when they had no base, no BLA base, no activist base in Northern West Virginia, etc. Remember, there's no real physicians committee. There's not even a letterhead. It doesn't even meet, you follow me? It's just a device so that the physicians committee demands TV time, and it's able to get it. I mean, they don't know how to cope with it, you see. And then they give the medical society time. Well, that's always a form. I mean, an idiot from the medical society talking is about as good as you can ask for if you want to oppose something. Then the arrogance and the ignorance of the coal industry and medical society apologists in the legislature was shocking. But we didn't know that. So that along with that, what we at Fairmont did was the following. Dr. Hunter, the medical director there, was himself a published expert on black lung. And we began to utilize some of the board there and all to reach the incumbent union leadership, to try to neutralize them. Get them off of the, in other words, the reformers wanted to overthrow the district leaders and their bills, and the district leaders, in other words, they'd end up in the legislature fighting each other. We tried to, without ever, sometimes we'd get them into one hotel room, down in Charleston. Usually it was unsuccessful, but they at least had heard each other. There was no dialogue that seemed to go anywhere. They had heard each other say that they were back in their own bills. The other thing was decided then is that with all the major medical figures from the medical societies going to speak, like the big societies of Huntington and Charleston, against just a ritual, if you follow me, that this is all due to cigarette smoking and there's no sign that, coal dust per se is harmful and all this stuff. What we did at Fairmont is our community consumer board agreed to spend a pile of money. We couldn't influence legislation in the strict sense as a nonprofit, but we could invite major speakers. And so we brought world-famous people to West Virginia. The first person being the one name from South Wales, Dr. Jethro Goff, who first proved the existence, you see, of the disease and was now an impressive man of about 75. And he, for instance, every picture I just showed you in a medical school, these are called Goff sections. He's a pathologist who first set the lung up to prove his case, sliced it into sliced tissue slices, 1/10,000th of an inch, and put it in slides. This kind of guy, strict proof man, with his heart with the miners. Then we brought in a leading chest specialist who happened to be Lyndon Johnson's San Antonio heart specialist, because he had a part in it. But another guy, textbook writer, famous on the American publishing scene. And then by a miracle, we got a hold of the Dean of American Radiologists, X-ray doctors, who had conscience problems. He had once, a generation before, testified against the victims of Gauley Bridge for the employers in West Virginia. And had ever since, probably we didn't know in soliciting him, he accepted so readily we could only figure out that he had ever since regretted his historic error that Gauley Bridge had become the symbol of silicosis proof in this country, where 18-year-olds died within 6 months of drilling, like John Henry, like the tunnel through the mountains of West Virginia. And he agreed to come down to testify to what? As the Dean of American Radiology, that an X-ray is not decisive. Remember, we got technical points to make with the legislature. You're not making populist points now. Now you're down to sections of the law. You're trying to say X-ray evidence isn't necessary. So you can't win except on technical evidence, so that I'm not going into all of that. But to get a good black lung benefits law, you need a series of technical things. And some of us felt that, the miners' strike was decisive, the grassroots were decisive, but you'd lose all of that if you didn't appear to have absolutely equal expert testimony and evidence for the case. The result of all of it, and I remember I'm crediting the mass movement as a decisive thing. The rest of it just became technical things, I think. The West Virginia legislature adopted in 1969 a highly advanced piece of workmen's compensation legislation recognizing black lung disease. Later in 1969, Congress adopted the Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act, which was later amended even last year, I think this December, into still more progressive directions the second time. This meant there was total recognition of coal workers' pneumoconiosis as a disease. There were presumptions placed in that law way back in '69. There were presumptions that made us, from the most backward country in the world, in benefit structure, we went way ahead of England, way ahead of the more advanced countries, because we placed a presumption in the law. The presumption was that if the miner was dead and the widow presented the benefits claim, then the evidence not only didn't require X-ray evidence, all evidence was presumed to be in her favor. Let me tell you how that worked out. It meant that it was irrebuttable to show any respiratory illness. So if in that dead miner's medical chart, 10 years before his death, he was in a doctor's office with a normal X-ray, chest X-ray, but complaining of a cough in the doctor's notes, that was adequate evidence. You see what I mean? In other words, the presumption was intended to run towards getting her a benefit. Because he was dead, he couldn't testify, he couldn't be examined, You got those. Later, you have more advanced presumptions, like the present law presumes that any positive reading of an X-ray is ironclad and cannot be overturned by a negative reading. So there's a series of presumptions that have been introduced into this law. Now, I've left out completely, and some of your questions are moving on it. The law, I'm only dealing with black lung benefits. But there are two terribly, maybe more important parts of the law, because benefits will ultimately run out if we prevent the disease, in so many decades. One is the prevention aspects. In other words, the air is measured at the face with a huge increase in the number of federal inspectors and now state inspectors in most coal states. And that air is measured so that it is intended that a new generation of young miners will not be taking in a dust level that could give them pneumoconiosis. And secondly, the law is full of safety provisions. I'm not dealing with that. It's the most advanced safety law as well. But if you must judge that against the background of American production. While the coal operators claim that Appalachian underground mines are not productive, they're comparing them with strip mines in the West. But compared with underground mines in any Western or Eastern European nation, we have the highest per man, daily rate of production. So that it's true, since 1968, the last year before the Act, coal production has been cut in half per man day in this country. Or if you take the number of men divided into total production, and it was averaging something like 18 tons per man day, that year it's down to about 9 now. Most of that is due to the additional men in the workforce that are required for either safety or contractual agreement purposes, or due to the numbers of checks for air ventilation, methane gas, dust, or 1,000 safety factors, anything from a dangerous motor to the very high-powered electric lines that go under. I'm ignoring, I say, all these kind of aspects, and I've taken just the black lung benefits issue and tried to follow it through in this presentation that lists some of the factors that were at play there.
The law that you just described is essentially the West Virginia law?
Let me say this. The federal law generally is the dominant thing on the scene. Pennsylvania has the most advanced state law, and therefore in Pennsylvania you will have men who will do better under state law in benefits or in safety, and therefore be better. But generally, I'm speaking of right up to now with constant changes in each legislature each year and all. I meant to indicate that the political fight, what Duncan asked me to deal with, how the movement, what coalesced. It coalesced in West Virginia. Everywhere else was subsidiary. Dr. Hunter, for instance, at Fairmont testified before the Ohio legislature. I could go off on the side issues, how it became a national fight, and he testified in Congress before both houses, and every year they had hearings. But that's beside the point. There were whole groups of people. It was this thrust, and out of that also came the reform movement, which overthrew Boyle, which in turn instituted Arnold Miller, and which in turn brought to Washington a very highly educated college full-time staff. Then when Miller and the college staff fell out, you've slowly drifted into the disorder and disarray that you see now, which we still don't know the answer to. How will the miners come out with democracy in their union with a coal miner elected leadership that is somewhat more representative of and more hopeful for the voting democracy that they finally got. Because if we were to accept the way it is now, then we'd say democracy is a failure too, which flowed out of that. In other words, it hasn't worked out that well to just give them democracy. But in answer to your first question, I'm talking in general the thrust of the federal law, although at times I've referred to necessity. For instance, West Virginia passed its law, so that pushed it. See, by then it meant Senators Byrd, and Byrd's a huge influence, and Randolph, the oldest senator, the only man still in Congress when Roosevelt was inaugurated, he still is. were huge influences, you see, on their colleagues, and they were swung over from being almost company-minded men, tolerant of UMW lobbying, to activist-inclined kind of guys, if you can imagine that.
Mike, what accounts for the very vehement opposition of the doctors? Was it just class loyalty to, or was it trying to cover their own medical tracks, or was there a real economic basis to not
No, I don't know an easy answer to that. Let me first say that there's a beautiful question asked by an English writer who wrote the history of the recognition like pneumoconiosis as a disease. And see, black lung was first called that in medical literature about 1807 by a Scottish physician doing an autopsy. That's what it looked like to him. And then it got lost and it got its technical name. Pneumoconiosis was never referred to again.
In England, by the way, sometimes known as anthracnosis, right?
Well, yeah, they usually, you're right.
Anthracite
Yeah,
is hard.
and remember, in Pennsylvania, you get a much meaner form of the disease and more disability. It's why Pennsylvania law, because so many of the eastern Pennsylvania miners are in anthracite gold. It's one reason why I'm showing you these pictures. It's so crazy. You can get a coal miner with a clean lung after many years underground, like those first pictures. We don't know why. Not a lung section. Let me explain what I mean. You can get it with a perfectly normal X-ray, okay? I don't want to speak now if he's alive. We don't know what we're like on autopsy, okay? These are autopsy sections you're looking at here. You can have another guy go underground for 5 years, and his X-ray looks a horror already. We're ready to do it. The doctors they don't understand that. They do not have the answers to a lot of these problems. Another thing is, it's an irrevocable disease. In other words, you better prevent it by reducing the microns of dust in the air per cubic foot, because the doctors can do nothing once it's in there. In other words, there's a steady decline of the person. And if we pull him out, best you can do is pull him out so he doesn't get anything else.
So it's not like
stopping him from
smoking. Yeah, if you stop smoking, supposedly you gradually
It's the
get
same
better.
thing. The sooner you stop smoking. So the first thing the British pioneered this whole field. They have a certain level described in their law where you pull a man away from the face of the mine immediately. He has to be brought to some back position away from the dust as soon as he gets to a certain scene in his X-ray. If he gets to a further scene, he has to be taken onto the surface. And it's a nationalized industry, so the cost of it is just like the military. It's part of the whole burden, in an energy field of the nation.
The doctors?
The doctors is what I want to deal with. The question, Michael John, the author of this question, asked it in the 50s, and we don't have the answer. He reviews the entire history of the literature, starting out with them recognizing what's wrong. I mean, why do these guys have different lungs than other people? This Scottish doctor says in 1807. And the British deny it exists till about 1930-something, okay? Everybody's been denying it exists. He says, why was it that after 100 years the wheel had turned full circle? Doctors were back at the beginning, again speculating about grave medical warnings concerning the danger of black lung and breathlessness, first made in 1807. Now, I think the viciousness of the reaction, and it's never been documented, but it's a beautiful one for documentation in West Virginia, was first of all this mass movement shocked the hell out of the doctors. Secondly, there were a few articulate, I remember about 4 articulate spokesmen that almost tried to match this committee of 3 doctors that were humane. And they happened to all be on medical society committees and all. So I think there was a knee-jerk response to defending their public testimony and their position. There is at the same time the Vice Chancellor of West Virginia University's Med Center, a guy I've known for years. He testified to cigarette smoking at the legislative hearings. There is a school of especially former British people over here, headed by W.K.C. Morgan, who believe basically that they don't quite say coal dust is harmless, but it's only dangerous under very explicit circumstances, and they keep trying to relate it to maybe it's the interaction with smoking or something. So there's so much scientific confusion that it's hard to say that the spokesmen were on the payroll of companies. One of those four just took a lot of company cases, probably 40–50% of his income is just from making examinations and finding nothing, you know. So he's definitely bought and paid for. Other than that, I think they viewed themselves as dealing with a revolution, and I think Buff's antics, because I've been there, he must have aggravated the hell out of him. You gotta realize the man would walk into a meeting room with 5 hats. That was one. He would act out 5 roles, you see. He put on, he'd have a black hat for miners, typical color, you see, with the lamp on it. He'd act out the miner. Then he'd have a white hat for the boss. Then he'd have another one marked Rockefeller. He didn't like Rockefeller either. The Rockefeller, you see, was subsidizing Arnold Miller at that time in the reform movement secretly. I mean, very wealthy forces subsidizing the reform movement. I haven't mentioned the foundations moved in here. Foundations move into a lot of things now, just like the media does, you know, in changing the political spectrum. Very wealthy foundations were funding the reform movement. So that he must have driven them absolutely batty. That kind of performance with a, you know, in a position and a member of that, well, Rasmussen wore a red beard, you know, and you could take them like you wanted them, but it was hard to knock off Buck, you know. He had the distinguished appearance of a doctor, and a little deeply, he was wrong a lot. I mean, I've been around him enough to know he wasn't, what he was saying was just sometimes very outrageous. He was carried away with himself. Rasmussen would just ignore it. No one would stop him, you know. They'd let him make his little pitch, and then they'd make a more scientific one. I can't account for it, except to say it was very complex. I think they were reacting to Buff's tactics. Some of them were bought and paid for. I think some were outraged by the whole thing. A state shut down while its miners were parading, demonstrating before the legislature. I mean, what's next? Revolution, you know? I mean, they can, who knows what they're about.
Let me follow up that question about the doctors. You said that if they went on TV and if they put the members of the local medical association alongside of them, they'd be very ineffective or stupid reporters. And several times you've come to the question of what constitutes political skill and what constitutes political stupidity. You can start with the doctors and make a distinction between what they actually said and what a politically skilled doctor might have said. Maybe that would help bring out the question of what constitutes political stupidity in this case.
Well, I think probably that vice chancellor was more deadly and effective because he said, I have no stake in the coal industry, you know, I have nothing to do with it, I'm not on any side. But I honestly believe, you know, he put statistics on the blackboard for the legislature to show, I believe that the cases I've seen of the worst massive fibrosis and, you know, collapsed lung and all this junk were where the man was smoking. You know, he would like that was much more effective, you know, testimony the other way. On the other hand, it was very hard by the time we had the most distinguished people in the country. They were off balance. You can understand that fighting Buff was one thing. In other words, Buff could hold a mass meeting together. Buff might not have brought the legislature and the smartest editors in the state, see, on the miners' side. You had to win over a big portion of the establishment to pull this off. For instance, just as to do it here, you certainly need the Raleigh News and Observer. You cannot, in other words, just agitate an issue, which you can do at the populist level, the way Buff was doing beautifully with ordinary people, without having some attention paid to the other forces that have to be brought into line. And I think that I'm describing that kind of skill. I saw Dr. Hunter's skills in describing for the miners what his research had shown, you know. And he could truthfully say that, you know, he had examined over the 20 years of practice 7,000, you know, miners and related their, you know, their breathlessness directly to them. And then he would distinguish between miners who dug into rock. See, there are a few occupations where miners are exposed to silica dust. One is when they're driving these roof bolts up, to hold the roof up. They're driving straight up 5 or 6 feet, which means they're going into the rock strata. So that he would distinguish that those men were definitely exposed to silica dust, you see, and then show how he had seen men with equal injury, while these men's x-rays showed silicosis. The man who had absorbed looked as breathless in every evidence to him and on pulmonary function test, but his x-ray didn't show it. See, the reason North got into this business of sectioning is that he was constantly puzzled in the 30s. He told me when I went to Wales and spent a few days with him. He was puzzled when he was younger by the fact that you couldn't prove it with x-ray evidence. You see why you had to have the law. These were always, what he began to do personally was every time a miner died, in every hollow he had visited every local union, and they called him down in Cardiff, and he would go out to meet with a local union president at the wake and get the miner's widow to sign an autopsy permit. And that was where, in other words, he will have proof, which I'm not showing you here, which he could show you this lung, see, something like that, and next to it a normal x-ray, you see. That's what's so powerful, and that's what he showed the legislature, you see. Here they say, these big shot doctors are saying, only thing you can have is x-ray evidence, you know. If you're going to recognize a disease, it has to be just like silicosis. But we forestall that by bringing in the man who could answer it in advance. There's no way to demand x-ray evidence because what you're saying then is that we have to wait for autopsy to prove our case, you know. From the grave, the man's going to say, I told you so. Too late, you denied it to him. But when I visited England, I struck with one more thing, and I've done it. They still autopsy. The widow waits for autopsy to get her percentage. I attended the Thursday morning autopsy sections in South Wales, and it's horror. No, the widows aren't there, but let's say there's 10 dead miners died just of natural disease. The widow's amount of benefit after his death will depend on the sections of his lung autopsy. So that if you want to see how we've left all that behind, if the miner's going to get $325 a month, the widow, whatever her benefit is, something a little less, she's going to get it on presumption that there's either anything showing in the x-ray, anything showing in the pulmonary function test, or anything showing in respiratory disease. They're going to presume from that she has it without further evidence.
You answered the question about doctors' tactics on two sides in a way, tactics for and against the legislation. I think what you're saying implicitly is if you put those local medical people on, if they acted in an unprofessional way, as if they betrayed that they were scared by the revolutionary character of it, so they were losing points with the audience, and so that they didn't keep their cool. You know?
Well, it was hard to keep their cool, too. You've got to remember, this was a legislative chamber. I was there, and we were down front, like inside the lawyer's rail, you know, putting on the witnesses from the different camps. There was not only a massive, but the entire proceedings had to be broadcast out into the entire state capitol. This was the largest room in it for a joint session. And the miners were everywhere. I mean, while this was going on, the state was shut down. So that it was not easy for a doctor to, in other words, the chairman had to constantly call for order to let him speak, you see. And you can see how this would stagger them, too. They were surrounded with an atmosphere of, that was going to be black lung grinding. Now, they pulled one more dirty little trick that blew up on them. They ordered a piece of research, the West Virginia Coal Association did, in January, as soon as the joint session was called for February. It was produced at Lexington, Kentucky, by an outfit which otherwise has some credentials, I'm told. I can't think of its name right now. It's a think tank that produces research in a lot of areas. But it took this order. In other words, it within 30 days produced a report this thick on pneumoconiosis, the message of which was no more subtle than what I just described as our tactics. We have to think through what we wanted Goff to say, Canada to say, knowing about what they've written and where they stood, what they were likely to say. In other words, you had to anticipate overcoming the need for x-ray evidence, each thing that I've described to you. So the thrust of this was, in effect, research on order, and I'm not thinking of the fancy name of this non-profit corporation that exists at the University of Kentucky. And it produced on everybody's desk during these hearings, despite a report about 2.5 inches thick, and paid for, bought and paid for by the West Virginia Coal Association. There was no doubt about that, because it was called to the attention of sheriff, they put on witnesses, the Coal Association described how much they paid for it, when they ordered it, when, all that came out. The remarkable thing is it was pretty corrupt. It didn't help them. Because when you try to produce a piece of research this fast, about all they could do was decide that they were going to get enough medical opinion and anticipate what we were going to put on that required an X-ray. So what they did was throw together all tables out of early articles that supported the idea of X-ray evidence being the only measure of proof. And then they mailed $50 bills to something like 150 or 200 distinguished doctors the nation over who had written in the field of something on all sides, and asked them to answer about 12 or 15 objective questions, told them they knew it would take their time. They anticipated it would take about an hour, and that time they wanted to remunerate them for it. But all this was brought out, you see, in the evidence, and a lot of them mailed the 50 back. That was in it. They ended up with, it was 150, 200 with, maybe 45 responses, and they ran that through computers about 50 different ways to prove the rest of the tables in the book. And that was a measure of something that didn't help them. In other words, looking at it, they should have thrown it away. They must have thought they wouldn't have to testify it, how they did. It didn't work out well.
That's an example. Policy analysis at its worst, I'm afraid. But to get back once more to this theme of political tactics, you said early in your talk that the establishment was a clerk-level mentality. Now, I think this was the kind of thing that was recognized in the early days of the student movement, too. I think the free speech movement in Berkeley knew that they could provoke the administration into doing certain sorts of things. Later on, college administrations learned something from one another. But I think there are times when you can see this as a move in a chess game and see what the other fellow is going to do if they're smarter than he is. Now, I don't know what the moves were, and I don't know whether you could give examples of kinds of errors that they could take and how it was recognized that they were a clerk-level mentality.
Well, I'm basing that more on having dealt with them on a host of issues over the years, so that they wouldn't have been able to deal with this either when they got to it. In other words, they just don't, they're not allowed enough freedom to think. If you go to them with any kind of question of health care, like an annual physical, they don't know any answer to anything. All they can do is get on the phone and call somebody upstairs. So that what I meant was just watching that over a period of years, it didn't surprise me that the young Vista people would have decided that, you can get away with anything here. I mean, Mississippi, you're going to have a much sharper, they may use dummies, but the central establishment is smart, and try to be.
What you were suggesting, in effect, is that the Vista people, or anyone working on the miners' side, began to get a sense of what would be reported to the front office. You said if they didn't use trigger words, it would be reported to the main office. So that this is, I think, a very general principle of political tactics, that if one wants to avoid provoking reaction, one has to know what things will provoke reaction and what won't, which is hard. I'm sure it can be done. I don't know whether it can be taught or whether it's something that people just learn on the front lines. Let me try another question. When the legislation came through, as you pointed out, it had a number of features besides the benefits aspect. First of all, on the benefits, who paid for the benefits? Did the mine companies pay, or did the taxpayers pay?
No, it was pushed off on the U.S. Treasury on the taxpayers. Only now are they making the mine operators.
So now
It's only in these latest amendments. And then it's maybe for the people who got benefits after 70. In other words, another way they reduced the operator opposition to this in Congress of that lobby was not to shift the entire burden to them. See, by making it federal legislation, there's no federal workers' compensation, and they therefore. Now this year they're putting it as 50 cents a ton on underground coal and 25 cents a ton on surface mine coal. That's the fund.
It's just a general fund. Because there's an economic principle that suggests that you get efficiency if the people who are creating the social cost pay for that social cost, like an effluent charge. In which case, the companies that had more miners receiving benefits would have to pay more. Now, that may not be able to administer, you may not be able to put it into effect. I just wonder if that principle ever came up.
Yeah, it was debated and discussed, and what you say is absolutely true. That one of the desirable effects of good workman's compensation legislation is to put the burden of the cost of lack of safety on the company so in the future you get safety. So that they didn't accomplish this in this particular case. They still haven't got it in proportion, to the burden.
Then to move to the prevention and safety aspects. When I think of prevention, as you were talking along, it sounded to me as though having all that coal dust in the air could produce explosions as well as black lung.
You're right.
And that there was a natural alliance there between the Farmington mine disaster and a two-pronged attack on getting both prevention and safety from these one provisions. Now, I don't know whether that was in the air, so to speak, all the time, or whether it accidentally came together at the congressional level or what.
No, you're exactly right. There was only one reason why that was not the principal one. No one knows what, they still don't know what caused Farmington number 9 to blow up. There's no final decision. Finished the hearing because as long as there are bodies in there, they don't completely have got out all the bodies. But Farmington number 9 released a great deal of dangerous explosive methane gas every day, on the order of 7 to 9 million cubic feet a day was released in the course of the mining in 1968. So that, that's enough to heat and light and do everything for a small town. And that's what was coming out, and that's what had to be diluted by enormous amount of ventilation going through the but you're right. A combination of coal dust in the air plus methane, so that those subsequent explosions, many people believe that they were both a failure to properly rock dust and keep down the coal dust, make it inert, and the existence of gas.
It's interesting the way these things went along in parallel, and yet at times, as you say, were not explicitly connected together. Now, I felt to some degree you were trying to connect them. There are two kinds of connection questions that can be asked. One of them you've dealt with, saying that sometimes there were and sometimes there weren't across these groups in West Virginia. What about the connections to the legislature? As you pointed out that there's a question of compromise. And what about the connections to Congress? Were there movements, for example, Harrison Williams, now he was from another state. I don't know whether anyone was coordinating from West Virginia with him, or many other states may have been involved by then.
I don't know enough to tell you, but it's very clear that very often a person from another state makes an issue and makes an actual reputation on it. He can later maybe get mine worker contributions to his New Jersey campaign. I don't know that there was anything like that in his mind, but he made this a very important issue. And the bringing down of the Boyle regime. You see, this rapidly became an anti-UMW incumbent leadership movement. They were linked.
Was that because Boyle was not doing very much, or was it because the same people were involved in
Well, you've got to remember,
reform?
we don't have we didn't have the murder of the Yablonskys at this point. We didn't
Not
have any
yet.
facts of that order to go on. So that I think Harrison Williams is a labor reformer, the kind of guy who wants to clean up the labor. He's chairman of the Senate Labor Committee, or holds some such title, and I think he wants to just have better quality people in trade union office, generally. Now, there are other things that, we've just referred to. For instance, when the same reformers, like Edgar James, one of these reformers in the mine workers, moved over to take charge of Sadlowski's campaign and the steelworkers. The reformers campaigned to overthrow the incumbents of the steelworkers union. It's not so easy to do. Very difficult to do. And he didn't succeed. You get parallels like that, you see. When Boyle was a sitting duck is another thing. Very few incumbent leaders would be that stupid and that slowed up. And I didn't describe the use of the federal courts. Tremendous use of the federal courts in the reform movement, which was not at this point black lung legislation. they paralyzed, they got the federal courts to paralyze the incumbents at a later stage.
Well, some fascinating questions in there. And all these efforts to take it into other states and other organizations show whether there's specificity and generality to it. I think there's a lot of generality, as you pointed out, but maybe not as much as some people thought. Any of the rest of you have any questions? Thank you very much, Mike.